Well, like mentioned earlier on, we are privileged and honored to be joined by the Africa Rugby President, Mr. Herbert Mensah, with us in studio this afternoon to just talk about rugby in general in Africa and what to expect from a rugby development point of view here in Africa. A lot has happened, more so from a Kenyan point of view, after having been eliminated or dropped from the HSBC leg of the World Sevens Series. Very painful indeed, but there's always, a comeback time. The question is, how is the path, and can Kenya, not just Kenya, but other African countries come up with this? We will be talking about rugby in general. Mr. Herbert Mensah is in the country, for the World Under-20 rugby tournament that's happening here. Of course, representing the rugby chairman, Bill Beaumont, here in the country. Well, it's a privilege and honor, and first and foremost, is to welcome Mr. Mensah in the country, Kenya. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to Kenya.
Thank you.
Then finally, welcome to Kenya Broadcasting Corporation. This is the home of sports. We say your true sports partner.
Thank you.
And of course, we are beaming live some of the matches of the World Under-20. So Kenyans are getting an opportunity to see what the world has to offer from a junior rugby point of view. So here we are, and you're at the right place at the right time. Karibu sana.
Thank you very much.
Well, Mr. Mensah, first and foremost, how is rugby in general? Of course, you are from Ghana with a lot of sporting history, having been at the Asante Kotoko football team. And I must confess that I was at Asante Kotoko, pitch a couple of years back. What a facility you guys have in Ghana. How is Kenya so far?
I think Kenya is fantastic. If it's how is Kenya as a country, I think Kenya is a beautiful country. I think it's awesome. I think it has a history of achievement. Mm-hmm. We're talking about sports. So the other day I was at the National Olympic Organization's launching of the 365 days to go.
Correct.
And the history, and it took me back because I'm an old man, so I still remember the great Kip Keino and his exploits. Mm-hmm. As a kid in Europe, I mean, he was the figure that was on television, and since then we've seen so many, from Dr. Paul Tergat to others.
To Eliud Kipchoge.
Everybody. Mm-hmm. And that is awesome. So Kenya represents a certain history and a certain place in my heart, and I think in the heart of everybody across Africa.
Well, very good to note that you have a good history of how Kenya has evolved from a sporting point of view. Ghana has equally, come up very well, coming up with very powerful names in football. Some, Osei Kufo, to mention just one of them.
That's right.
And the Abedi, boys, very, very young, talented boys. I've been to Kotoka. The facility, you can't compare the facilities that are in Ghana with what you're seeing at this part of the world. But that's talk for another day. Let's focus on rugby. The World Under-20 rugby tournament. Kenya has been given the nod, and Kenya is currently hosting. We know there is another also happening in South Africa. How does this make you feel as, the president of Rugby Africa?
Look, I'm hugely honored. I'm here to witness something great. I'm here representing Sir Bill Beaumont, and I think that we need to give great credit to World Rugby. I think we were here last in 2009 for the confidence that World Rugby has reposed in Africa. The under-20s in South Africa, and then for me, the big one for me is the one here in Kenya. Hosting an event like this in Africa, where we could have been anywhere else, is clear indication that the world has not forgotten Africa, and is enough confidence in the government of Kenya, in the KRU, that we have no problem in hosting such a global event here, where you have nations from all over the world coming to compete here against our finest, which is Kenya and Zimbabwe.
Well, Kenya, Zimbabwe getting the nod after a very entertaining Bates Cup final that we witnessed here in the country, about a couple of months ago. Here we are. You came into office early in the year in March. A lot is expected from you. What can you say, based on your plan? There must be the short and the long-term plans. In your short-term plans, what are you looking at in terms of achieving as you set your goals in terms of, your current tenure, having come into office in March? What are your short-term plans?
Well, I think that that's an important question. Certainly, as the president of Rugby Africa, for me, it cannot be business as usual. There must be dramatic changes. And I believe in structure, having come from a background of being involved in football in a previous life at Kumasi Asante Kotoko. I'm a businessman in my own right. I'm an economist by training. I think you need to put structure in place if you want to realize your dreams. And so we come into office and we revisit where we are. And quite clearly, I've seen the need to establish fresh committees and to bring people on board. I am so happy that from a Kenyan perspective that we have two great Kenyans that are now either members of our EXCO or who are on committees. Moses, the vice president of KRU, is a member of the rugby committee. So he has a seat at the high table, as we call it. And then we have Paula, who I'm here with today, who is an EXCO member and who's also on the World Council with me at World Rugby. She's a council member. She represents women's rugby across Africa. So the committees have been established, but we don't want to have committees who are just there in name. So we have made sure that the terms of reference, the KPIs for each committee is very clear. So we're in the transformational process of getting in structure to make sure that the 4 years that we're in place, that the right thing is done. I've come into office on specific mandate. I push very strongly for a review of governance across Africa and governance within Rugby Africa itself. There are lots of things that have not been looked at. There are lots of things that have brought disagreements across Africa. So I've immediately initiated a constitutional review. That's what we're doing right now. Very seriously, we have to take into account gender change. We have to take into account things that are not said in constitution within Rugby Africa, align it across a continent which is mainly French. There's Anglophone, we have the Arabic Francophone North, and to bring it all together in a way that will make us an efficient unit. Because leading up to the election, people would have heard me talk about the fact that sport is big business. That was part of my mantra. Sport is big business and a critical need for mindset change. Mindset change within the African continent, a mindset change with our partners, World Rugby, SARU, FFR, and everybody else, to understand that it cannot be business as normal. We need to have a fundamental change if we're going to be able to achieve the goals and aims and the dreams of the young people who love rugby. So with those pillars of where you want to go and understanding that commercially, if we're going to be able to get investment into the game, that we have to reposition ourselves. Reposition ourselves with World Rugby to say that the budget that you give us is simply not enough for us to be able to have competitions that work. Reposition ourselves with governments to be able to say to governments, to presidents and to ministers of sport that Africa is where the talent is. The most gifted athletes in the world are African. We need to bridge the gap between training, nutrition, the process of where modern sports is going. And if we can do that, with governments getting involved and then global bodies looking inwards, then you go back for sponsorship to specific corporates. Then we can raise the game of where we need to go as Africans, because you only need to look at the national teams in Australia, New Zealand, in Europe, if we're talking about African players, who are representing France and England and the rest of it. NBA players who are African. UFC champions who are African.
Correct.
The greatest boxers who are African. Presidents of major nations who are Kenyan. Clearly the talent base is African. But we have to understand that maybe the balance equation is skewed against us. I was yesterday at a KRU event with patrons and directors and sponsors, and they showed videos of young Kenyans who were now getting into rugby, who are now being encouraged by wonderful coaches who are doing it selflessly, and you see them training with no facilities because they want to be the best. Just imagine if we reached a point in time where investment is there, and the same system through the schools and the youth provides an infrastructure and an ability for them to also develop in the same way as a child in South Africa or a child in Europe gets in those facilities. Then you can imagine, therefore, that the quality would be the best. Because I watched some of the games. I flew into town to represent Bill, but in watching Kenya play and Zimbabwe play, and I've watched the Spanish and the Uruguayans and the Scottish and the Hong Kong America, for me, the most talented athletes there were the Kenyans and the Zimbabweans. Then we ask, but then why are they not in the final? And for me, it's a simple issue, and I think this is critical, and I say it to everybody, that if you don't play enough test matches, you're never ever going to be number one. And in Africa, the investment that is in for us via competition to be able to play enough tests. The big nations are playing 8 test matches, 10 test matches in a year. And what we will have here are, we play the Bartes Trophy and then you go straight into a World Trophy. So if you see the athleticism of Kenya and Zimbabwe, I mean, at times you say, wow, I mean, this is just extraordinary. But modern sports is all about set pieces, transitional play, and what you do when you go through the phases. And you'll see that the choices and decisions that are made at some point in time are indicative of the fact that we're not playing enough test matches.
Mr. Mensah, very good point there you've brought in terms of test matches. Africa is plagued by non-existence of continental competitions. How do we come up with more so that we can expose these young ones? Because personally, I'm a firm believer of the pyramid. If you want to get the best at the top, you must fix the base, which is the youth. So how do we come up with many continental tournaments or matches that will expose our young ones and give them the opportunity, like you rightly put it? They are not in the final because lack of probably match fitness or lack of exposure into big matches.
Probably exposure. Match fitness they have. I have so much confidence in the young boys of Kenya and Zimbabwe, most definitely. Look, there's a grassroots program that we have seen. I believe that Kenya has started that. As I travel around Africa, there are many countries and many governments who are investing hugely in the youth as a structure in terms of moving forward. We do have competitions. There's the Rugby Africa Cup, there are the sevens tournaments, there are the women's tournaments, but they're not enough. And that's why we're reaching out on all levels. One, we're in the process of negotiating with World Rugby now for different structures that give us greater investment. But secondly, there are a number of countries within Africa who are now saying, we are prepared to work with you at the Rugby Africa level to ensure that we can have the kind of competitions that will provide greater equity for our national teams when they go forward. So that engagement with government, with corporates, with our bodies, our global bodies, have to come together and assimilate as one, so that therefore you can get more and more competitions of a higher level. And recognizing that a great country like Kenya would benefit more by playing like countries like Uganda and Zimbabwe, Algeria, Namibia, rather than playing Togo or Ghana or Rwanda or Burundi. We've really got to provide rugby for the whole continent, but recognize we've also got countries who are world class. And therefore they need that push and a little bit more to reach that. And that is part of the mandate and part of the challenge that we have to be able to create those kind of competitions and get funding in. But we can only do it if it is we have the marriage between government on one side, then the ourselves in Rugby Africa and our global bodies as well.
As we do that, Mr. Mensah, you've clearly brought it out very well that we must also play some tough teams, very well positioned teams in terms of rugby. The easiest way to become a giant is to kill a giant when you play such big teams. Let's now look at, personally I look at it as one of the darkest moments, in Kenyan rugby this season. Kenya eliminated or dropped from the HSBC 7th circuit. Very painful indeed. How did you take it, first and foremost, as the president?
It was very painful for me. Kenya is number one for us. South Africa is tier one. They're there.
Correct.
But Kenya is, it's more than just our representation at HSBC. There is a global cultural fan base.
Correct.
And I cannot imagine HSBC 7s next year taking place without the presence of
the Kenyan
Kenya
crowd.
Absolutely. But the trouble is that once you drop out, to get back in becomes very difficult. And that's where massive investment is required. Change in mindset and an approach that says, Operation Get Us Back In. Because there are other countries across the world who have dropped out, across the world who have to go through their own now qualifications series to get back in and to be one of those top countries that stays in the HSBC 7. So Kenya's elimination is very painful for me, and I believe very painful for the world, because as it has been rightly pointed out, for many people, if you don't support your home nation, you support Kenya.
Yes.
So we have to do what it takes to get Kenya back in. And it's difficult because the global world has changed. Economies have changed. Money is more difficult. Other countries are getting greater investment through different schemes for their athletes to be able to compete. But it is very important to me, to Africa, and to Kenya, that Kenya gets back up there.
Now that we are on a mission, like you rightly put it, Operation Get Us Back In, one of the key ways in terms of getting not just Kenya but getting more African teams going back is having regular tournaments. Is it possible to have an Africa Sevens series, like we see with the HSBC World Series? Is it possible to have the same but within a different, a set period, so that it doesn't conflict, so that we can have regulars, we can have teams locking horns, and by the end of the day, it gives us that opportunity, to get back?
I think it is possible. The question is, as we came back, that sport is big business and you come back to money. I believe that when we look at sports and sports tourism, and we look at governments who understand that the children are the future, and understand the fact that in this global world we still need to be relevant and to be noticed. We are looking, at the moment there are a number of countries who have said, raised their hands and said, we want to be a part of it. Mauritius, for example, have raised their hand and said, we will invest, we will pay hosting fees and rights to be a part of a seventh circuit. In speaking to your neighbors, I realized Ugandans want to be a part. Zimbabwe have national elections this year, but they are very keen on developing the women's game and getting involved in this circuitry. Nigeria has just been readmitted after a 2-year ban from rugby and are playing incredibly well. We are waiting for His Excellency President Tinubu to name his new sports minister, and then to approach La Côte d'Ivoire, want to get involved, and I'm talking about governments here, want to get involved in the process, as do 1 or 2 North African countries. So we are carrying out an agenda in terms of rugby from the previous administration that was signed off. So we have no real input for 2023, just to host the tournaments and make them better than they were before. But for 2024, 2025, 2026, we have to be creative and bring in different structures and programs. And we are looking at that. Whether it becomes an African Sevens tournament or whether it becomes one that is more specific, that deals with those with the potential to really get up to that level, and that's Kenya, Uganda, Zim, and there are a few countries like that, Madagascar. Now you've got the Algerians and the Nigerians playing extraordinary sevens rugby. But it is the way that we have to go. And I know that the EXCO members who are in charge of the rugby committee have come up with proposals that we're studying right now within the limited budget there is. And we're now looking to go out and see who we can do business with in order to bring in the money so that we can actually expand that base.
As we look into that, another aspect and key pillar of the game is the women's rugby. What are your plans around women's rugby? Because mention women's rugby in Africa, you just think about Kenya, you think about South Africa. How do we bring up the other nations so that women's rugby is equally very strong?
Well, you forgot Madagascar.
Madagascar, exactly.
Cameroon.
Very, very.
So the point is that there is massive potential. I watched the women's tournament this year in Madagascar, and the stadium was full. This was women in Madagascar. There were 10 to 20,000 people in the stadium watching the matches. So that was extraordinary. South Africa won because they play more matches regularly at a higher level. Kenya was second with a fantastic display. Madagascar, who play more rugby than anybody in Africa. They play more rugby. They got full leagues, with full stadiums. It's extraordinary to see rugby in Madagascar. The third, and Cameroon, who had been banned for many years. For me, they showed great potential and they showed what Africa can do. So we're now looking to see how can we expand that women's competition for next year. How can we bring in a tier 2 level, like a B competition, for the next level going through? So we're looking for funding. The women themselves, if you look at the growth of the game in Africa, is actually amongst the younger people, both boys and girls. So there's huge possibility for us to look at a women's under 20 going forward. And so therefore we start looking at funding. Gender balance and gender issues are critical for me. I think it's hugely thing, not as a buzzword because they do it abroad, but I really do believe in the power and the strength of womanhood. I think it's key and it's fundamental. And even in my own country, even as non-rugby players, we have pushed women's rugby to the point where I think we were second in Zambia recently, even beating the mighty Zimbabwe in order to reach there. We have to encourage women at under 20, at full level, and we have pathways that we're looking to develop in the future at under 18 and so on and so forth. There are more countries. The same model of business and sport and governments and investments, but certainly in my tenure you will see an expansion of the women's game.
Well, very interesting because women rugby is critical. In football, I personally believe if Kenya is to make it to the World Cup, it's easier through the women than through the men. We will talk about a few structures in rugby. Before we engage Mr. Mensah to find out that in football, Africa exports players and imports managers, football managers. Is it possible that we turn that around in rugby where we export managers and import other players into the into the rugby game? We'll talk about that when we come back after this short commercial break. Welcome back. Remember, you are watching Game On your weekly program that comes on KBC Channel 1 every Saturday afternoon, just to bring you up to speed with what's happening from a sporting point of view, both locally and across the borders. We are privileged and honored to be joined by Mr. Herbert Mensah, the President, African Rugby, with us here in studio, just giving us his general view of what his expectations would be like and what he would be looking at in terms of making rugby great to the next level. Before the break, we were engaging on women's rugby. Let me now engage Mr. Mensah to find out that, part of your platform during election time was raising the profile of the African game. And in so doing, you're looking at making the sport more accessible. How do we make it more accessible? Maybe from a corporate point, if you live a lot corporate, you also have TV, because it's business and TV is part of business.
Well, you're right. Sport is big business. And the challenge we have in Africa is that Africa is a massive continent. I met with some expats yesterday, and I told them that you can put 3 to 4 France into Nigeria. You've got 1.3 billion or so Africans. We're massive. And yet it is, through colonialism, you have some of us speaking French, some of us speaking English, some of us speaking Arabic. We don't have one television network to enhance and to capture everything that we're doing. So it's very difficult to go down that route and then have TV rights that are then available as a commercial tool to reinvest back into the game. You're having excellent coverage by yourselves of the tournament here, and then we have to stream it because it's not covered right across the continent of Africa. That is a challenge. I think that what we need to do down the line is to make sure that rugby is part of the national curriculum right across Africa. Why should it just be football that young kids play? The getting into rugby programs that both boys and girls can play is now being played across most of Africa. And we need to develop that in a way that it becomes a way that every child now sees rugby as its choice of entertainment, to go to a park with a rugby ball and throw it with friends and then get it from there. We need to get to a point where nations dedicate stadia and parks for rugby. It's beginning to happen. Even in my country, Ghana, my president, His Excellency Nana Akufo-Addo, is building an all-purpose rugby stadium. So that'll be ready for the All-Africa Games in March next year. And rugby is being admitted for the first time. We've been able to negotiate that. And there are a few other countries who have also committed to building rugby parks. So if you now have rugby stadiums and parks through Africa, it's more accessible. If it's part of the national curriculum, when schools now in break time have a choice of football or rugby, then it is that it becomes more accessible again as a sport. And then it is that money then starts looking at our great sport and says, you know what, this is the way to invest your money for the future.
Well, as we look at those are, just some of our file pictures around the women's rugby, clearly a big one indeed. Mr. Mensah, after the 4-year tenure, what is it that you'd look at by the end of the day and say, this was a success? What is that 1 or 2 things that you'd be looking at by the end of the tenure and look at and just have a pat on the back of every member of your team and say, guys, we did it?
Well, I think that what have we come into office off the back of? Governance, number 1. Sport is big business. So in terms of governance, we've already started a constitutional review. If we're successful with the constitutional review, that will be a great achievement. Governance-related matters across the continent, we're tackling that already. We're already resolving matters in Cameroon. We're resolving matters in Morocco. We're actually out there trying to resolve those matters and seeing if we can get a commonality in terms of where we go. So if the structures are put in place, which is what we have started already, and we're already making very fast progress. Then we have existing competitions. We're making them more attractive. You'll see Madagascar, you'll see the Sevens in Mauritius, Zimbabwe to come soon. We have the tournament here, the World Rugby Tournament. We're making sure themselves are a lot more attractive, better organized, perhaps so than before. As we go into 2024, 2025, we're coming up with a different blueprint for rugby. So therefore, the type of competitions we play, and then getting that partnership between ourselves and greater stakeholders. We've already started with a bang in the first 120 days, and we have extraordinary commitments from a number of countries already for 2024, 2025, 2026. So I think by the end of the tenure, if all of the things that we've signed off on actually do happen, better competitions, more money coming into Rugby Africa, different competitions, more for the women happening at the same time, resolve governance-related matters, changing constitution, better relationship between ourselves, our governing bodies. We are coming to renegotiate our relationship with FFR, French Rugby, with SARU themselves. Then it is that we're in a better position. And in 120 days, we have already started.
On a light note, Mr. Mensah, what's your favorite food?
Sadly, you don't have it here. Or you might, but not in the way we have.
Okay.
Fried plantain, West Africa style. Mm-hmm. You know, so that's with ginger and pepper and the rest of it. You know, that's, I guess. Cooking is my hobby, so everywhere I travel, I try and sample little things that we can do to change diet and food. I'm very much a carnivore, so I'm into meat, and there are different types of meat. But locally, plantain, I guess, would be my favorite, yes. You had it in Kumasi?
Yes,
didn't
exactly.
you?
Yes, when I was in Kumasi, that was years back.
So you can vouch for your viewers that
Definitely,
it is a supreme food.
It's something you don't want to miss. The moment you try it, you'd be like, some more, please.
That's
but
right.
I hope Paula and the rest of the team have, taken you around to also sample, the Kenyan delicacies, the nyama choma and stuff. We'll find out from Paula. You
can find out from Paula. I know that Moses and Paula, everywhere we've gone, they've said, don't eat that. Try this. This is the local food. So I've tried the variations on maize pap kind of things, which are very interesting. We have different variations in West Africa. Mm-hmm. It ferments for longer in the corn leaves. And I know that before it's out, I will be eating, if not speaking, Kenyan.
You should have learned one or two, Swahili words by now. But it's interesting to know that you as a person, started off in football, now in rugby. What is it about sports for you that keeps you going?
I think sports is life. As a kid, I was always into sports. I'm a bit old. I guess if I was younger now, my parents would have said to me, concentrate on sports, you'll become rich by playing sports. But I come from the era of, hey, do a bit of sports and get back to the books. So I've loved sports from the age of 6. I was in a boarding school, so I played football, rugby, hockey, swimming, athletics, tennis. So I have an interest in all sports. And at this size, I'm too big for football. But as a kid, football was my main sport. And then as I grew older, I played rugby in schools. I then played club rugby in England. I went to Zimbabwe. I played for Old Hararians and played one international there for Mashonaland against Italy. I was back in Europe. I played one season with Saracens. So rugby then became part of me. I played provincial rugby in England as well, the days they played provincial rugby. But every sport I watch, I see something in it. There's a certain excellence in any sport that is being played. And I try and tell it, if it's rugby players, you should understand that the issue of balance, coordination, hand-eye coordination, and decision-making. So it then comes from discipline. Do you have that life that is so disciplined? Because every great sport, whether it's boxing or UFC and certainly rugby, is about discipline. And that discipline then becomes a norm of how you tackle, how you catch, how you pass, how you support, and then how you train. And you train to be better, to be stronger, to be fitter, and to support whoever it is that you play with. And that becomes fundamental. And I think there's no greater proponent of sport than rugby.
When we talk about rugby, let me ask you this. It's off rugby. A picture that might be still fresh in your mind. Sammy Osei Kufo shedding tears when they lost the Champions League final.
Yeah. Sammy is a good friend of mine, younger brother. And I keep saying to Sammy that we have the luxury of boasting many great footballers. Apidi Pele Sr. won the Champions League with Marseille. We have, there's a Junior Sekufo. We have many. We have many from Michael Essien and so forth. Tony Aboa, who stormed the Premier League in England. Leeds United and scored goals that if you Google today, you still will not see goals like that being scored.
Correct.
But Sammy played with number 4 on his back for Bayern Munich. You know, you've got a few great teams in the world. And Bayern Munich, over the last 30, 40 years, Bayern Munich have consistently been there. And Sammy played and started at that number 4. And to see him in tears at the end of the game, a game that they were winning, they were better, they should have won, but fate, and that is fate for you. But nobody can ever take away what it is he achieved at Bayern Munich. And look, at some point in time, we have to do an exchange. We have a pedigree and history in football, and you have a pedigree and history in athletics, in rugby, and in cricket, and so many different things. As Africans, we need to find a way sometimes of, can you imagine that one day a plane lands and Sammy Kufo gets off the plane, Asamoah Gyan gets off the plane, Abedi Pele gets off the plane, Tony Aboa gets off the plane, Michael Essien gets off the plane, etc., etc., etc. And we on the other side, you have the greats that you have in the world of athletics, and in this great game of rugby also get off the plane. So we're no longer looking north and south. We're looking east and west across ourselves, where we can share and understand how you have athletes have so much stamina and so much greatness who are Kenyan, who have something to offer us on the other side. But at the NOC, I said I was a little bit upset about Kenyans for one thing. Huh?
Please.
And I'm going to repeat this everywhere I go. The best sprinters in Africa are West Africans.
Correct.
What is this man Onyala now doing?
Ferdinando Manyala.
What is he doing? Has he not remembered that it is our slot?
Ferdinando Manyala is just trying to say, Africa has what it takes.
Hey,
Africa has what it takes.
We are so proud of him, but and I haven't yet started telling people he's West African, because he's not. But
when you talk about that, I mean, African, the sprints, one big name that comes through is Frankie Fredericks of Namibia.
Namibia.
Yes, a couple of years back. Ferdinand Manyala has just come up to say that it's not just a West African affair.
That's right.
Also, yes.
That's right.
But Mr. Mensah, the biggest lesson, personally, I learned from the Osei Sammy, case is in whatever you do in life, you will fall. What matters is how you react, how you pick up. Because
Absolutely.
he picked up himself and eventually held the Champions League trophy.
Yes. No, you're right. Yesterday there was a young coach, I forget his name, and forgive me, Coach Weru, I think, who is a young guy, and he made a presentation about young Kenyan boys that he's helping, and he said, it is not about the falling, it is about how you get up.
Correct.
Which is rugby. You're falling all the time and you get up. And it is life. And it is how you get up. And you're absolutely right with Sammy Kufo and with the others who've been there and done it. There's a Kenyan lady sprinter. I forget her name. Yesterday she clocked 10.79, I think, at a meeting in the UK.
That must be Kedogo. Anyway, we'll find
it's
out.
one of, yeah. And it is, you can lose, and then you start winning. If the mindset is right, the commitment is right, and you get it, there is a commitment that you make, a selflessness that you embark on, that you, those early hours that you wake, that you train, you work on your weaknesses, understanding your strengths. And in our game, you understand that you have friends, you have people who are shorter, taller, faster, bigger, but you work as a team. And you fight together as a team. And it is that spirit that takes you through, if you have the facilities, to train harder, be better, jump higher, run further, and then the decision making at that critical moment in time will always be right.
My director tells me time is not on our side, but I will ask you this in, say, 30 seconds. What would your message be, to the Kenyan rugby fan, looking at you now?
Believe in yourselves. Kenya is great. You cannot be great today and not be great tomorrow. And I just ask that everybody rallies behind and understands that they are winners. They will get back again with the support of government, with the support of me, and with the support of the fans, who are the most important people there are out there.
Wow, very strong message. Believe in yourself. We will get back with the support of all the stakeholders. That includes Mr. Mensah himself giving that commitment. Thank you very much, Mr. Mensah. We appreciate you making time to be with us this afternoon. We hope you enjoy your stay in Kenya, and I'll take it personally tomorrow to ensure that at least you sample some nyama choma.
I will, and if I can just give closing words, that
please.
If I believe in you, believe in yourself. Okay. I'm not Kenyan, and I do believe in you. That's why I've traveled and I'm here.
Wow.
Believe in yourself.
Believe in yourself. Thank you very much. We appreciate you making time to be with us.